Botany Bay was the name given to an area of coast by the British naval lieutenant James Cook when his ship Endeavour landed there on 29th of April 1770, marking the first British engagement with the great southern continent, now known as Australia. Cook originally named the place Stingray Harbour, but changed this after a week because of what he called the great quantity of new plants collected by Mr. Banks and Dr. Solander. Joseph Banks was a wealthy, handsome young man who was passionate about botany and who himself financed the plant-collecting aspects of Cook's expedition. Working with the Swedish botanist Daniel Solander, he collected 132 different species of plant, previously unknown to European science, while the Endeavour was anchored in the bay. These included eucalyptus, the lemon-scented myrtle, and the Banksias, named after Banks himself. On his return to London, he became a huge celebrity, establishing major collections at Kew Gardens and elsewhere, changing the face of British horticulture. Before Cook named Botany Bay, there was an indigenous place name, Kamay, which means fresh water in the Darawal language. The Darawal people had inhabited their lands for more than 50,000 years before Cook arrived. This makes the naming of the land, the claim to British sovereignty, and the plundering of resources, including plants, contentious to say the least. Much of Britain's imperial history is intricately bound up with planting and horticulture. Plant collectors would travel to discover new specimens which would be hybridised and transported to be grown under the plantation system, a system that involved clearing the lands and destroying the ecosystems within which indigenous people had lived for thousands of years. Today's climate crisis is a legacy of this history, and that's one reason why the voices of indigenous people are so important as we strive to mitigate it. These are the gardens of Chiswick House, a former aristocratic home in West London and a partner on the Botany Bay project. The gardens were landscaped in the 18th century by William Kent under the patronage of the Earl of Burlington. Apparently derived from Roman, Greek and Egyptian models, a more material basis for the garden was in Britain's own imperial wealth at that time. The kitchen garden, which dates from 1682, shows very clearly how plants from the colonies came to be part of what we regard as quintessentially British gardening, food and leisure. Of the garden highlights listed on today's blackboard, dahlias and French beans both originate in Central America, which was colonised by Spain, while squash is a North American plant, cultivated and eaten by native people as part of their Three Sisters method. Tobacco was one of the most important crops of all for Britain's imperial wealth, grown on plantations in Virginia. It had long been used by Native Americans as a sacred healing plant. In British hands, it became a dangerous, though highly profitable, addictive drug. In autumn 2021, Chiswick House and Gardens was the first British stop on the journey of Totem Latamat, a message about climate change sent to the political leaders gathering in Glasgow for COP26 by the indigenous Totonac people of Mexico, working with Border Crossing's Origins Festival. At Chiswick, the totem was welcomed to Britain by the Mayor of Hounslow, Mexico's Deputy Ambassador, and pupils from Chiswick School.
There's so much I want to change about our environment, but the one thing that's been on my mind is plastic. Plastic has changed so much around our world. It has cluttered our oceans and killed so much of our sea life. It takes years to biodegrade, and instead of stopping it, we are producing more. We are all in this together, and there are alternatives. Let's wipe this out.
Mundo, cielo, mandan.
The totem's arrival in Chiswick, where it was also blessed by Quechua shaman Kulikindi, marked the beginning of an important collaboration between border crossings and the gardens in the Botany Bay project. A project that will lead to more nuanced and rounded understandings of how colonial history relates to horticulture, and how indigenous approaches might help us to move forward in healthier and more sustainable ways.
I'm Melinda Schwakhofer, textile artist. I'm a long way from the Muskogee Creek Nation and our traditional homelands, but I always have been. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, California. My dad, who left Oklahoma when he was just 19, deliberately cut himself off from his Muskogee roots. So like many people with Indigenous American ancestry, I grew up disconnected from my native culture and family. Over the past 15 years, I've been using my artwork to connect with and journey to my Muskogee identity. The terrain on Dartmoor, where I now live, is so like the traditional homelands of the Muskogee, with many rivers and woods. Yaupon holly is part of my journey. It's a plant that has been used for thousands of years to make what the Muskogee call the black drink. Yaupon holly tea is very pleasant to drink, but it can also be used as a dye. Since textile work is part of my practice as an artist, I decided to use the tea to eco-dye linen fabric and cotton thread. The first design that I stitched from the dyed textiles is this lemon scate, or infinity symbol. This represents balance and an unbroken notion of energy where everything flows in relationship. The movement in the design embodies the ever-flowing path of energy exchanged by humans and more than humans, such as plants and animals.
The Manchester Museum and the Garden Museum in Lambeth are important heritage partners on the Botany Bay project. At the Garden Museum, you can investigate how plant collectors set out across the world during Imperial times, categorising and developing plant life towards the intensive farming approaches which are causing so much environmental disruption today. Outside the museum are two tombs. One of them commemorates two gardeners, a father and son, who were both called John Tradescant. The younger John was particularly active in travelling to the New World, as it was known, bringing back numerous plants from the American colonies. Potatoes, tomatoes, avocados, maize, chocolate. So much of what we eat today is the legacy of empire. The second tomb memorialises William Bligh, most famous today as the captain of the Bounty, whose crew mutinied in the Pacific. What is less well known is that Bligh made that voyage to export the breadfruit from Tahiti to the Caribbean, because it offered a cheap and efficient way of feeding large numbers of enslaved people. Even something so intimate as the food we take into our bodies is bound up with colonialism and globalisation, the histories that have suppressed indigenous cultures, that are directly responsible for racial injustice, for economic inequalities, and for the ferocious heating of the planet.
Yaupon holly is an ingredient of the black drink, which has been an important part of the Mississippian culture since at least 700 BC. The black drink, which contains yaupon holly and other ingredients to give it emetic properties, was ritually drunk, usually by men, as part of ceremony. Yaupon holly tea continues to be used today in the Muskogee Nation, ceremonially and as a social drink, like tea or coffee. As a Muskogee person living in the UK, I am incorporating a plant which has been used by my people for thousands of years into my current body of textile work. I am reclaiming a plant that was colonized and brought to this country more than 2 centuries ago. When I make buckskin on Dartmoor, or look up into the winter sky at the constellation of the Great Hand, or incorporate Mississippian iconography into my artwork, I connect with the Muskogee, the Muskogee people, past, present, and future. I see the same star patterns and perform the same activities that my Muskogee relatives, meaning all the Muskogee people, are familiar with. I'm using it to make Mississippian symbols in this time and space, and thus restitching the past, present, and future together.
The Botany Bay project is not just about the history of plant migrations and the destructive effects that colonialism has had on indigenous cultures and ecosystems. It's also about an active engagement with indigenous approaches to growing and eating plants, rooted in principles of reciprocity. Our participants will be creating new sustainable gardens that follow indigenous planting practices and ethics, leading to healthy diets and a sense of how we as humans are a part of nature, rather than seeking to dominate it. Our horticultural partner, Capel Manor, is London's Environmental College. We will be working with them to identify and understand the indigenous heritage of their gardens, the Native American approach to cultivating pumpkins, marrows and squash, the Mexican heritage of chilies, tomatoes and cacti, the indigenous Australian use of eucalyptus as a disinfectant, a tonic and for dental care. They will be working with us to cultivate new gardens in schools and community spaces, gardens which offer models of healthy and sustainable horticultural and food practices to participants, visitors and the wider community. It's a reciprocal relationship of the kind offered by indigenous cultures in the way they think about the natural world. As the Native American botanist Robin Wall Kimmerer says, "How generously plants shower us with food, literally giving themselves so that we can live. But in the giving, their lives are also ensured. Our taking returns benefit to them in the circle of life making life, the chain of reciprocity. Living by the precepts of the honourable harvest, to take only what is given, to use it well, to be grateful for the gift, and to reciprocate the gift."
All over the UK and throughout Europe, there are plants that were brought back to their own countries by colonizers. Maize, potatoes, rhododendrons, they were all transplanted from their original locations. With Yaupon holly, we need to recognize where it came from, its original usage, and how it is still being used today. This is not a piece of history. It is a living plant that still plays a role in Muskogee life in the 21st century. We should also be looking at how we talk about plants such as Yaupon holly. The story told on signage in botanical gardens or on websites and other places should reference the colonization that is an integral part of the plant's story.